have some spare parts already lying around. So that should help fill in whatever holes that might be left to you if you're missing a tire or something. So, and not all of the vendors have sent me invoices last I checked, but most of them haven't, so I paid them through PayPal and going through the ACM budget, and that's really good. So that's the update on Mindstorms. It's working, it's happening. Let's just hope it gets here in time. The reason why that we haven't gotten it done sooner is because we were hoping we would get kits, but all we got were EV3 units and no kits. So it's an explanation on that a little bit. Moving on to our little presentation here. CSS is cascading style sheets. They're used on the internet to make your websites look presentable, usable, pretty. If you've ever visited a website that looks like it's only got text and images and the layout is just really, really long, that's because the CSS did not load in correctly. It could end up looking something like that, which is what we're going to be playing with today. Let me zoom in for you. All right, so this is just some template that I pulled off the internet and modified a lot that we'll be playing with. This is our playground, and this is the code. This guy right here, you don't need to worry about it. All it does is basically when I update a file, it will refresh the browser for me automatically. So the problem with CSS is that when we want to describe what we're going to style, we have to first look at an ID or a CSS tag. Typically, there's other things, but I'm not going to go into the minutia, the weeds of the CSS style system. But you have your selectors. These are selectors that you can use to grab what you're going to modify. So we've got our body tag, which we can edit every tag in the set. If we had multiple body tags, for example, in a HTML page, which, by the way, would violate the standard, you'd be styling them all the same. If I were to do something like H1, and we wanted to change the font family to Arial. How do you spell Arial? Does anybody know? A-R-I-A-L. All right, and I do that, and I save that. What happens in the background is that it's going to update my file, and it's going to refresh this. Sometimes it won't. And what happened to this guy right here? This is my H1 tag in HTML. It restyled it so that way it's now an Arial, and everything else is in Google's Roboto font. So I'll just put that back. When you want to select something very specifically, because your CSS can get out of control if your style is really, really complicated, you could go like, all right, body, hash index, and by the way, this is an ID. IDs are always supposed to be unique, so you can guarantee that you're selecting the thing that you want because an ID is supposed to be unique according to the standard. And then you go and say, all right, we want to get an element within the header. So we type in header, and then we type in H1, and then we can set the font family to Arial. And then what happens, it's now Arial still. But then what if I wanted to change something like every element in our nav, right? So if I want to be super specific just like it gets very redundant. We get body, tag index, header, nav. Oh, and let's get the unordered list in there. All right, so let's type in UL, and then we're going to say, well, we don't want to show any bullet points. We're going to say list style, and we're going to set it to none. So no more bullet points, because that's what UL does. Does anybody know how HTML works? Yes? A little bit? A little bit? So unordered list, you can have IL, which is, I think it's OL, which is ordered list, which means you're going to use numbers, or UL, which is unordered list, which is bullet points. And each one of these is in the LI tag, which is a list item tag. So we're able to style them. Anyway, whenever you have a menu bar on a website, they usually used a unordered list to create that menu bar because it's structurally easy to work with for the most part. There's other ways you can do menu bars, but why do something that works pretty well to begin with? So we're going to make it so we don't have bullet points. Well, look at this. We've got a lot of duplicate declarations here. We've got our body index, we've got our header index, our header, and then we've got, oh, this is where it begins to diverge. Wouldn't it be really nice, because this is how CSS works, wouldn't it be really nice if we didn't have to do that over and over again? So if we wanted to, we could say, oh, body index, well, we've got our header. All right, let's go in here. We're going to do header. And then we're going to go to, oh, this is where it gets really weird because CSS does not do this. H1, and then we go to nav, and we're going to say, all right, well, just in case we have other things in our nav, we'll just make that open for us. And we're going to do UL, and we're going to make that open. And we can just get rid of this guy. We're going to cut that out of there, and we're going to put this in here. Let's fix the indentation just because we like to look pretty when we're coding. And then we're going to do that here, and we're going to paste that in right like that. And we get rid of these all together, and then we're going to save. And I'm going to save again because sometimes the compiler doesn't speed up fast enough. Well, I refresh, and ta-da! I got a broken picture. Oh, there it comes. But it worked. And what's going on in the background is, while this is not valid CSS, I'm using what's called SCSS or SASS. There's different file types. One's a strict way of writing the code, and one's a non-strict. I'm using non-strict because I don't want to have to be pressured into worrying about my spacing and type and stuff like that. So it compiles it into CSS for me, all machine-like, and that ends up looking something like this. Here's your real CSS. This is what the browser is actually using. It's compiling all of this stuff. Well, in material shadow, we're ignoring that for now. And so remember, I had that list style. Well, it figured out by my scope saying that, oh, well, because you've got it inside your body, your header, and then your H1 is in there, I can just take those strings and concatenate them together, and now we've got ourselves a line of CSS code that's valid and that the browser will appreciate. And so it will do all of this stuff for you, but wait. So I'm going to do something really magical. Magical. I like to use Steve Jobs terminology. I'm going to do this weird stuff here. I've got a whole bunch of asides in my code. This is part of the HTML5 standard. I've got one aside, actually. I've got one aside here in my code, which is part of the HTML5 standard. You're not going to see this in CS 213. I think that's Web Engineering 1. Not very much of HTML5 is taught there, but and then I'm going to make it so that way my aside border radius is going to be round, and I'm going to include this guy here that's called material shadow. This mysterious thing, these two things that I'm including, one's border radius, one's material shadow. They're very mysterious because you have no idea what border radius does exactly because it's practically a function. And then another one is material shadow, and I'm passing in two parameters. Oh, and I'm also passing a parameter in material border radius. Can you guess what that's doing? It's rounding my edges. Yeah. It's rounding my edges by 2 pixels. So I'm going to do that, and we've got a margin top on at the very tippy top, and let's make sure that we can actually see it from the background and stuff. So we're going to change this to be like let's do CCC, which is a color and hexadecimal values. We're able to abbreviate in hex because it just, well, I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole other topic. So I'm going to refresh here because my compiling is slower than my refresh rate. And then all of a sudden, whoa, I've got this thing that is rounding my edges. Does that look round to you? It should look a little bit round. Let's zoom in a bit. It's a little bit round there, and whenever I move over, the shadow gets dropped. Well, that's pretty crazy. Of course, we've got this little issue here where, you know, the nav bar that we haven't worked on yet is on top of our thing, but that's just, you know, a side effect. Well, what did I just do? I've got this guy here, I have this person here, and this function here, and this function here. So I'm going to show you this function. I actually wrote this a while ago, a long time ago. when Google first released their material design standard, having shadows and having paper and making it so that way things have depth by having a shadow and stuff, so that way it gets your attention better. I was like, oh, that's really cool. I wonder if I can implement that in CSS3. Well, CSS3 lets you do animations and shadows and lots of other stuff like 3D. Not going into all that stuff today. I don't do everything with, in that area with 3D especially, but it's possible. And so I've got this thing called a mixin, which is a function-like behavior, and I've named it material shadow, and I've got a parameter which I've declared, or it's a variable, which is called level, and I've got another variable called hover animate, and I've set it to false, which basically, if you've ever done C++, you can make it so that way your parameters are optional by assigning it inside of the function definition. So I've done that same kind of thing here. Now I'm going to expand it, and bam, I've got a bunch of if statements. I've got an include, and so I'm saying if level is equal to 1, then I'm going to add a box shadow, and let's actually move this over here so we can see more of the code. All right. Got a box shadow, I've got some animation thing going on in here, and I've got a whole bunch of these includes, and then I'm doing a hover effect and stuff, and I'm basically saying, all right, if my level is 1, then I'm going to have a shadow depth of this amount. If my level is 2, it's going to be even longer shadow and a longer shadow. And then I have this hover animate false. So if it's false, it's not going to animate when I hover, but when it's true, it does animate when I hover, and it makes the shadow longer. So that's a little interesting, isn't it? And so I have all this stuff packaged up in a mixin, which is a function. And all I have to do is, if I ever want to make something look like it's going to hover or have a shadow like material design does, I just drop this mixin in, set my shadow level, and decide whether or not I'm going to animate it because I've declared it that way. I'm calling that function. And then when I save, I'm going to show you how it works. When I save, I'm just going to it will compile it down to my CSS file because it's watching me. It's watching when I save my files. So the tools that I'm using to do this is a little bit of a combo. We've got this thing called SASS, CSS with superpowers. Now, there's a competing standard. It's called LESS. And I'll tell you the differences, the big fundamental difference between them. First of all, less is used on Bootstrap, but the next version of Bootstrap isn't going to be using less. Less is a JavaScript syntax used to do CSS a lot like SASS operates, except it's done on the client side, or you're going to need to have a JavaScript interpreter on the server to be able to handle less. And for a lot of people, it's not very attractive, and so that's why we're moving to this situation where we've got compiled CSS. We're actually able to have a little bit more control to a certain extent because it's server-side, and we basically don't have to deal with, we're dealing with a simple Ruby application and so on. There's a lot of stuff. But yeah, it's moving to SASS. And SASS can be extended. First of all, it has like a lot of documentation. It has a lot of built-in functions already. It lets you do your mixins. It lets you do variables. It lets you do stuff with syntax, and it has data structures like a map, the map data structure. So you're able to do a key-value pair requests and stuff like that. And we're able to do like color manipulation and extending. Oh yeah, I'll go into extending. That's actually really cool if you're being lazy. And then there's debugging. There's expressions. You've got your loops and control statements. You've got your directives and output styles, however you're going to like have it spit it out. Let's look at, from the beginning, we've got a way to handle colors. So we've got a whole bunch of named colors and stuff. I wonder where it's taking me. I'm not going to go there. Let's go to a method list. You've got all of these methods that we're able to call here that are built into it. And when we write in our code, we're able to actually use these methods and do research. So to SASS, src, unify, value, visit root, stuff like that. Imports. Oh yeah, we can do imports too. That's when we'll get into that too. Let's see. We've got CSS. We've got something that we can do. Does anything catch your eye? Let's go into CSS object. I'm looking for something like want to find something that does colors. So we've got a function here that's able to compute RGB values. We've got a function here that's able to compute RGB values with an alpha channel. We're able to mix two colors together and assign a weight on like how much it's supposed to be distributed, which one's stronger than the other. We're able to do different color maps. So we've got HSL, we've got HSLA, we've got hue, saturation, lightness, adjust hue. So we can take a color and we can just modify it using the correct color formulas that are used, which is actually kind of complex when you get into color theory, and I don't even want to talk about that. But it makes it really easy if you want to do something with your colors. You just call these functions and it will let you mix this stuff all together. But what I'm using is SASS, but with Compass, and Compass is a plugin. Compass is a plugin that lets you do a lot more stuff. I'm using Compass, and one of the functions that it lets me do is it lets me build a project. So I say Compass create. When I have Ruby installed, I've gem installed Compass, it installed all my dependencies, SASS, everything that it needs, and so I call Compass create in a folder, and it will generate my SASS or SCSS files, style sheets, and the build rules for the instance that I'm working with. And then I'm going to go to like help documentation or code reference. That's probably a better place to go. And I'm going to look at all of these like helpers that we've got here. So here we've got something that lets us deal with, I'll go back to this, animation. So remember how I told you how we are able to do animations in CSS3. So if we want to make it so that way we don't have to do JavaScript, we don't have to program to define how our animations are going to work, we're going to be lazy and we're going to say, well, let's just use the built-in behaviors in our browser because our browser is smart like that. And we're going to call these functions in SASS, and it's going to, what it's going to do is it's going to say, all right, well, if we've got our default animation duration, that's a variable. We can set it so that our default animation duration is actually shorter or longer than what SASS is going to define. We're going to scroll down. These are all variables that we can configure and override. And then we've got our mix-ins. We can do keyframing. Keyframing is basically like an animation, if you study it, that's when the master drawer creates a drawing that's, and then the other animators, they fill in all the frames in between. So you set a state, and then it's going to move to that state, transition that into that state for you, and then you can go to the next keyframe for it to transition into. Then you've got animation name, animation duration, animation delay, timing function, iteration, direction, fill mode, play state, and then the animation function, which will just do anything almost. So we click on one of these guys. Oh, none of those. We're going to look at an example. Is there an example for this? Probably not. I'll find another example for box shadow. There we go. So if we were to call like one of these functions, we say, we look at the SCSS here, and it says include box shadow for the element that has an ID of box shadow custom, and that's right here in our example, box shadow custom. He's setting it so that way the shadow is red and that it's got a, well, let's find out. We've got to figure out what our parameters are, right? We've got the vertical offset, the horizontal offset, vertical offset, the blur, the spread, the color, the inset. That's a single box shadow. For a regular box shadow, we've got any kind of parameter, and it will decipher it for us. Where am I? I'm going to go back or forward. I'll go there. So we've got our box shadow, and it says, all right, we're going to have an H offset, vertical offset, and our blur, and we're going to make it red. And so now we've got this red box right here, and it's doing that little shenanigan. Well, if we go back to the code that I was showing you, that I wrote, we expand it, we see that I'm calling box shadow, and I'm basically doing a lot more. I'm saying, I don't even remember. I wrote this so long ago. But I'm setting it to have like 2 levels of shadows. We've got our color, which is basically black with an alpha channel of 37%. So it's got an opacity of 37%. We've got our length, our blur, and so it's just basically pointing down. It's a shadow that's only going down, and it's going to blur and spread out a certain amount. And that works out pretty well for us here. So that's really, really handy, because then I can just say, well, I want this behavior to be distributed across a lot of different elements, so I just have to say, okay, we're going to define these elements and do that. All right. That's really nice. That's just like a lot of the cool stuff that the biggest selling points of SASS or CSS, depending on what file type you use. Let's go into these guys, and specifically import compass reset. What reset does is it overrides the default values, the default behavior of the browser. We have this problem on the internet where we have like a whole bunch of different web browsers. We've got Internet Explorer, we've got Chrome, we've got Firefox, we've got Opera, we've got Safari, we've got a whole bunch of other unnamed things like Gecko, or I don't even know. But they all render the web a little bit differently. It's been getting better because they decided to adhere to standards. But back when Internet Explorer 6 was like the shiz, it was a giant steaming garbage heap. And so they introduced this guy here, which says, I don't care what you think the internet is supposed to look like. I'm setting you to factory 0, and you're going to become what I tell you to become. And so what happens is when I import Compass Reset, I end up looking at something that looks like this. I get all of this stuff that says, look at me. I'm not going to let you do anything. There's no margin for a body. There's no padding. There's no border for all of these elements. That's what we do when we have all these elements. These comments mean that every single one of these tags is going to not have any of these attributes. They're going to be set this way. And then we've got HTML. Its line height is always going to be 1 when it starts. And we've got list style, none, border, collapse, table, stuff like that. This way we're able to get a better guarantee. We can't promise, but a better guarantee that our behavior is going to be consistent upon every browser that we work on. Every website that we create is going to look pretty much the same because we've reset the browser and have eliminated all possible, well, almost all possible situations that might come up out of the way. We can't promise that Compass is going to be perfect, In fact, Compass is, like most people, have decided to ignore, that Internet Explorer 6, 7, 8, 9 has ever existed. Because what programmer ever wants to pretend like those things ever existed? But anyway, there's a long story behind Internet Explorer. I'm not like trying to rip into those guys. It's just that developers have had lots of issues with them in the past, and I was one of them. All right, so we have it reset for us. Then what else does this do? Well, we've got this thing called Compass CSS 3, but we don't see anything that talks about resetting it. Nothing that resets it. What this is doing is it's bringing in a whole bunch of methods or mix-ins for me to use. Remember how I had that box shadow? Well, I imported that mix-in by including this file into my compile series. It's not going to print out any code when it renders the CSS, but now it's grabbing all the stuff that's in here and looking at it and say, am I using any of that code? Yes, I am. So I'm going to start executing those actions. The big benefit of being able to use mix-ins and stuff like that is part of that cross-browser compatibility issue. Did you know that when you are writing in CSS and you're trying to do a box shadow, there are like 5 different possible ways you could do a box shadow, and some of them are specific to individual browsers. A big of a problem, but you still want to cover all of your bases just in case you have some granny that hasn't updated their web browser since 2009, and now you've got some sort of you don't want your website to look like a giant garbage mess. And so when we have our mix-ins here and we're using these mix-ins, we're able to account for every single one of these possibilities by writing a function that will print out onto our CSS that says, all right, for Mozilla Firefox, the box shadow is going to be this way. For Internet Explorer and all the above, they're going to be like this. And then for all standards-abiding browsers, it's going to be like this. And that way we're able to get a pretty good approximation and very good one-to-one ratio between all of our browsers. Cross-browser compatibility is such a huge pain if you're dealing with people that haven't updated for a long time. It is like a major issue. A good example of it being a very major issue. When you have a website that's fairly popular, it's generating money and stuff like that, and you look at Google analytics, one of the things that it will tell you is what browsers people are using, and you're going to see Internet Explorer is using Internet Explorer 9 is 30% of your market share, and I'm like, crap, 30% of my market share is using an outdated browser with a very small JavaScript execution and all sorts of other things, and it doesn't support a lot of CSS3 functions that have been part of the standard or draft standard and stuff like that. And so now I have to gracefully degrade and stuff like that. Well, we can cover as much as we can, as we possibly can with this, and then we can introduce stuff into our JavaScript that will flag saying this browser is not capable of doing that. I'm not talking about that today. There's a lot of stuff here. I'm just talking about SASS. All right, so I'm really lazy. I don't want to type this code over again. I really don't. So I just want to say, you know what? Oh, you know what? I just want to use the same code that I had written in my aside right here, and I'm going to drop that all into my section. And my section, for all of you that are watching, looks like this. Here's the section. There's a footer. So I've got two sections. I'm going to make it so that my aside, everything that I've written in my aside is going to end up in here as well. It's just copy pasting for me. If I'm writing one line of code that's doing a copy paste operation, well, that's pretty cool. I like that. I'm not going to be writing code like this forever. I want to get done and out of here so I can get lunch. And so I have made my extend. And so now that I've extended it, where is that thing that I was looking at? Java Bean, Slack. Is it here? No. This is what happens when you have way too much stuff open and you turn on your down and Chrome's like, oh yeah, here's all the things you were doing before. Let's put them all on the same desktop. All right. That's not what I want. That's not what I want. Is it gone? Yeah, it's gone. All right. Let's see if I've got something here. Nope. I gotta find my path to my file, but let's see if there's an open. Control O. Yes. Otherwise, that would be such a big pain. All right. All right, back to this. Do CSS like a boss in 2016. So I'm going to go back here because apparently I didn't save. Yes, I didn't save. And then I'm going to refresh this guy. And all of a sudden, like I said, it copy-pasted all that code and bam. I've got myself a whole bunch of boxes. I didn't have to write that code over and over again. In CSS, you totally would have to write that code over again. You definitely would. All right? I'm not even joking. It is such a huge pain. And imagine you saying, all right, well, we've got this element, we've got it to have a shadow, and then we've got all these other elements inside of this element that are inheriting properties from our parent, but this one element is not supposed to inherit the properties of our parent, therefore we've got to override the behavior and stuff like that. Well, you're able to get rid of that problem too because you've got SASS, because you can control your scope a lot better. So this is just a small example of like the magic of SASS, because now you're thinking like a programmer. Now you're thinking, we've got scope, we can do nesting, we can do mixins, we can do copy and paste without really doing copy and paste. And now we've got a way to make our websites really fast and with potentially a lot less code. In some cases, it can just get a lot more complicated, but it's easier to read. Because what ends up happening is that you can look at this code here and say, oh, I know exactly what this is messing with, because I've got it all nested here, and look, I can map it. I've got a body tag here, there's my body. I've got a header, oh, there's my header. I've got an H1 tag, there's my H1. I am applying a font family to H1. I can look at my HTML and my SASS code or my CSS code and say, oh my goodness, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Because I can read it. I'm not reading a line of code that's like an if statement all in one line, or a loop that's doing like 5 things all in one line and nobody decided to press the enter key when they coded it out. This is actually like saying, yes, we actually can read this stuff. You're able to figure out exactly what it is what the problem is. Now, we remember that we had this thing where we have import imports and stuff. Well, what if we actually wanted to make it so that we don't have a master CSS file, master SCSS file. We have multiple files that do multiple things. We've got one file that manages colors. We've got that all it contains is a bunch of variables. See these? These are variables. All this file will contain is variables. It will say our font families, our colors, the border sizes, the shape of our shadows and stuff like that. Pictures, who knows how many pictures, font families. It does all these variables, and then all you have to do is just say, all right, well, we've got our font families for our default font family in the body. Well, that applies to everything. And then we've got our body background, and we've got the body background. And our text color, we've got different text colors. We've got a text color for something that's a warning. We've got a text color for something that's like, what color are we going to make it bold like black, or do we want to do something like a dark red or something? I don't know. You can make it so that way you've got these behaviors, and then when you have finally coded everything and it's crafted and it's all done, and you've got all of your variables in place, and then the client comes and says, I don't like that color. You just go in there and you change that variable, and bam! All of a sudden, all the colors that were using that variable, all the elements that were using the variable suddenly changed their color or font family or pixel width or whatever it is that was going on in there. It just changes and gets rolled out to everything else, and it becomes continues to be a complete functional CSS. You're making yourself a program that makes code for you. All right? Is this cool? Is this cool? Is this making sense? Yes. Good. I'm glad. What about you, Art? Since you just switched majors, you can appreciate this, right? All right. So, yes.
You probably said it, but I missed it. How do you include the SASS in the HTML?
So we don't include the SASS in the HTML. We are including the actual compiled CSS file. Our browser doesn't know how to read the SASS code. But you want to know something interesting? They're getting better at that. They're able to, browsers are now able to, in some cases, see due to like whatever it is in the compiled output. And I haven't done a lot of research into this, but I thought it was pretty interesting, and sometimes it can be very annoying. But you're able to, your browser, like Chrome, is able to read this and say, oh, this is coming from a SASS file. This originally was a SASS file at one point. Let's see if we can find a map of the SASS file. And so it looks, and it tweaks the file, and it checks to see if such a thing exists, because SASS will create what's called a map file, and it will let you, it will let the browser be able to examine this code here. And then what happens is that map file will let the browser understand what's going on between the compiled CSS and the uncompiled SASS or SCSS file that you're dealing with. And then when you're in your browser's dev tools and you're looking at the styling rules that you've applied there, you want to end up seeing the CSS file. You'll actually end up seeing in the dev tools this stuff, and you'll be like, oh wow. Well, the downside is that you can't really edit this stuff in the dev tools anymore. You could if you were looking at the CSS, but you're able to go to your file and say, oh, that's where my problem is, and you just change that. It's pretty handy because they're getting smarter. But still, this is not part of the standard. This is an open source project. This is not part of the web standard. People aren't going to like embrace this thing because they don't have control over it, like the international standards organizations that govern the World Wide Web do. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Now, we've got this situation where we're going to have multiple files to handle different concerns. Just like in Java, we have classes, and they all occupy their own file. Well, we can do the same thing. I'm going to show you this project that I worked on a while ago, and I'm going to show it through GitHub because I was lazy and I didn't like download it. Also, I didn't have a lot of time to like prepare something for all of you. But this is a project that I've been working on and has stalled out for a little bit. Probably I'm going to just redo the whole thing. But this is an example of a very complex SCSS style of job that we've got going on in here. So if I look at my base styles SCSS file here, and I open that up, well, what do I have? I've got a bunch of imports. This lets me extend like external libraries, and then I've got this variables thing, and I'm doing a star star and then a slash star, and so I'm using SASS globbing, which is another tool that lets me just grab everything in any folder that exists in here. And then I've got another folder called abstractions, and I've got vendor folders, which means if I have SAS code that I didn't create, then I'll put it in the vendor folder because that's a convention that you're supposed to follow that says that I don't have ownership of this. I'm just using this, but I have no idea where I have some idea of how it works, but I can't promise you that I'm going to be able to fix it. Then you've got your base and your components and pages and stuff, so page-specific stuff. And so it's importing all of these files at once. If I didn't do this, then I would end up having to write this all out, which I've commented out. I just figured that this was a lot more convenient because then I can make a file and not have to worry about doing this. I just have this there for debugging purposes. I would comment this out and then comment in what I want and then figure out what's broken. And then I can go to like my pages. All right, so I've got this pages stuff, and I've got a class, which is a class like we're in a classroom or a class, not like a Java class. And then it's importing this. I've got this body, and the body has a class called noType class, and so every page that is of the noType class, it's going to apply these styles. And so I've got a 3D button. Oh, wow, there's a mix in there. It's going to make a 3D button like it seems like it does. And so that button's going to be light blue. It's going to have something that's white because that's what that means. And then we've got a demo button thing that we're dropping in here. I think it's like creating it's a string that I'm passing in here so that way it knows what to name the stuff it spits out. And then 3 pixels. Who knows what that does? It just works right now. But I'm making a button. Isn't that cool? Because I'm able to make a button, I'm able to style it any way I want, and I just have to use a mixin to create your button style. And then if you add your parameters, then you're able to say, all right, well, my button style is this button's going to be blue, this button's going to be gold, this button's going to be green, this button's going to be 5 pixels, this button that's a really small button, but it's probably talking about margin. And then you're able to set like the way that the button is supposed to be, computed. And that works out pretty well because I have this thing that manages it for me, and all it does is create code for me. It writes it for me when it gets compiled. All right? So I keep on going. I've got all these buttons, and I've got a single text shadow, so I'm able to apply a shadow to the text that exists in these elements. I have no idea what this is because I don't have the HTML open, but this is just an example of what's going on. And so we keep on going and going and going. We've got breakpoints. We'll talk about breakpoints. Have you ever wondered how websites, when you resize your window, the website gets rearranged? I knew I do. When you change the width of your browser window, the website rearranges itself so that way it looks smaller, but it's still readable, it's still usable and stuff. When you open up your phone, you've got the small version of the website, and then when you look at it on the desktop, it's the big version of the website. But then when you make the window really small on your desktop, it's the small version of the website again. This is called responsive website design. What they do is they introduce what's called like breakpoints, and these breakpoints get executed when the screen or the width of something gets to a certain range. So when it gets less than this amount, then it's going to start executing this breakpoint and then apply a bunch of code that you didn't have applied to you before. Sometimes it will hide elements, sometimes it will add elements or swap things. That's just an example. That's supported in CSS, and then people also use a combination of things like CSS, JavaScript in order to handle these operations. But it's still pretty handy. And you're able to get a mix-in that will just handle the breakpoint. And so here it looks like what it says. When my screen width hits 900 pixels or below max width, so it's not going to execute when it hits over 900, I'm going to hide whatever it is in the left column. I'm hiding something. And that makes it so that way it's able to support mobile better, because my left column is not optimized for a small screen. And then I scroll down and I say, okay, well, we've got this left column hidden. What do we do when we want to show something up? Oh, we've got something that says min width. We're going to change the display to a table cell. And then max width, we're going to make it so that the width is auto. And so we've got more breakpoints for our right column. And then I've got this thing called card. Well, card is another mix-in. In material design, they have this concept called cards, and it uses a shadow and stuff. I basically created this thing that handles a situation with card. I don't think that this is, it applies anything that has a tag card, but this card specifically needs to have this margin setting. All right, a class card, anything that has a class card will have a certain display, but here I needed to make a little tweak to it so that way the margin would be right. And here I'm extending, I'm being lazy, I'm saying, well, I've used this code a lot. I use this code a lot in my file, so you're able to take your really long CSS code, and you're able to copy it all, and then on the internet you can find websites that will let you paste your SCSS code, and it will go through it and say, well, you've got this element here that's used in 5 different places, so let's make it an extend. All right, we're gonna turn that into an extend, and we're gonna create these little tiny packages that let you just add all these extends and make your code a lot more compact and more succinct. And that way you're able to have better control over it for you. It finds matches and it just fixes all that up for you. Sometimes it's too aggressive, sometimes it's not aggressive enough. I don't know. I think it's mostly errs on the side of being too aggressive about finding matching. But it's pretty handy. And then we've got more stuff here. This is more breakpoint stuff. Media screen. It's more breakpoint things. So we've got this, and that's a partial. And I'm able to execute all that stuff in there in my partial. And then abstractions. So one of the things that I worked on this project is sprite sheeting. Sprite sheets are when you have a website that has a ton of pictures. Picture, and be there a lot. And you have these individual files, and they each are a server request, and you have to load each of them individually. That means that what's going on between you and the server is that you have to open a socket, you have to contact the server, you have to request this file because it was an HTML file, wait for the file to be downloaded. And when the file is downloaded, ask for the next file. It does this over and over and over again. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just download one image and then we'll be able to just make it work as like 5 different images? That's called a sprite. It's when we create a master image, it's a JPEG, for example, and we put our images in little parts right here. In early video game days, they used this technique. They had one image file, and it had Mario, and he would be like in different poses and different actions and different stances and stuff like that. And depending on what's going on, it would just shift the display. It would say, show this, show this, show this, show this, and that's how it would work. It would just selectively show a part of that sprite sheet. Well, we're able to do this in browsers, and it's actually really efficient. If you go to Google's website, their home page, for example, trust me, I'm getting somewhere with this. When we look at the source code, no, we won't look at the source code. We'll look at the, we'll inspect it. Their source code is a beast to behold. We'll go to network and we'll refresh. We want to capture stuff here. We're going to then selectively look at all of their images, right? We've got this thing called photo. That's probably my picture. Yep, that's my picture. We've got this thing called nav logo. Oh, look. What is Google doing? It's doing exactly what I said that we can do. We've got a sprite sheet. They've got the Google logo. They've got their arrows. They've got every single character there. We've got different camera images, map images. This is a pretty good sprite sheet because these are elements that Google uses most frequently, at least at this stage of their website, right? And so we're able to look at this and say they're being pretty efficient with their code. They're making one server request to handle a whole bunch of situations that just cover a lot of stuff. Let's see, let's see if I can show you an example. See if I can find the spell. I don't think I can. That's probably a font. That's also probably a font. We've got phones for some reason. We've got Google Maps logo. We've got airplanes. We've got a deer. If I expanded this, I probably would see a deer. We've got diamonds. We've got the star, partial stars. So it looks like some of this is used across multiple products of theirs. Yeah. So we've got this sprite sheet. Well, how do you make these sprite sheets? Well, you carefully create each individually, and then you go into Photoshop or some image editor like Paint, and then kill yourself because you're using Paint. And then you're going to paste each image in there and space them carefully so that way you don't have any overlap and stuff like that. And then you're done, right? Well, that takes you 5 hours. right? So what if we just created the images, or we just get the images in the first place, and then we put them into a folder, and then we tell SAS, oh yeah, by the way, in this folder, we want a sprite sheet, so just turn all these pictures into a sprite sheet. It will do that for you. There's tools that will let you do that. It will create a sprite sheet for you, and not only will it create a sprite sheet for you, it will create a map that will let you type that you want to show up in the mixin, and it will say, here's the map, and this is what I want. And so you've got your key value pair, and it will return exactly the position that you need to look at for what you're trying to show up on the screen. And then you have to set your div, because you're going to be using a div or some element. You're going to make sure that the size of your div is the correct size, so that way you don't end up showing more than just a magnifying glass. You're going to show only a magnifying glass. You have to make sure that the size matches the sprite that you're showing. This way you do only one server request. This way your website loads a lot faster, especially on slow connections. These are front-end optimizations that you end up doing. In the back end, that's a whole other story. So this is how you can do CSS like a programmer. Now, in my code here, we're getting on time, but in my code here, where is it? This guy? I created a function for a very specific purpose, not person. I created a function, and I was like, okay, we've got this situation where we've got screens that have different pixel densities. We've got our iPhone with a Retina display. We've got phones that actually have more superior displays than what Apple thinks exists in the world. And we basically, when we load up a regular picture, it looks like crap, because there's so many pixels on that screen that now it's doing subpixelation, and it's basically blowing up your image without making it look like it's blowing up your image, and now it looks a little fuzzy, right? Well, we've got a problem. Sprite sheets, we can't really accommodate that, but we can if we get really, really smart. And that's what I tried to do. I created this mixin. And what I said is I've got four different folders. I've got one where we've got a standard pixel density. I've got a folder that has a pixel density that's like 1.5 times more dense. Then we've got one that's 2 times as dense as regular, 3 times as dense as regular, and then I created images to match each pixel density, and I put them in individual folders, and I made a sprite map. And then I made this function that says, all right, using these sprite maps, I want you to print out code that will have a breakpoint, that will detect the pixel density of the screen that the browser is on, and then load the appropriate sprite sheet on that screen. So now I'm able to have non-blurry sprites. And I'm also being a little bit more efficient, because I don't need a really big sprite sheet that's very heavy for a very low pixel density display, but I do need one that's very pixel heavy on a high density display. And this is why people that are on MacBook Retinas and stuff end up using more bandwidth than normal people do. Is because they're downloading these high resolution images and they don't even know it. So that's not always true. That's just a joke. So I made this so that way it will create a break and it will detect the sprite. And then we've got this problem because now we've got a scaling issue. Our sprites are bigger than other sprites, and so now I'm like making sure that I scale them correctly, that my positioning is right, and that my div is right, and everything else is being resized and fit into the div correctly. And so it was very complicated. I got it to work. This is an example of a really complex problem that you can solve with SAS, because pixel densities are values you don't really have control over, and then you've got a whole bunch of other factors like scaling and positioning and things like that. But you're able to do it. Doing CSS doesn't have to be scary. You can actually be really smart about it and use these tools so that way it can take care of the scary stuff for you. Does anybody have questions? Now we're at the question. We've got the 5 minutes for questions. No?
In HTML, what's an aside?
An aside is basically like a thing that would be on the side, I think. If you go to HTML5 Doctor, it will explain to you the correct way of implementing anything. So we've got ourselves an aside. We go to that, and it says, an aside represents a section of the page consisting of content that is tangential, whatever that means, related to the content around the aside element. Wow. Which should be considered separate from that content. Sidebars and typography. So this will give you an explanation of what elements are supposed to be used for. Any other questions? You? No? Nobody?
What's a section in HTML?
Same thing. I go back, you go to section, take me to section. It's on the screen. In order to get up and running, you need to install Ruby on your machine. Open up a Ruby-enabled console. Type gem install Compass because you want to be able to do the watch folders and all that stuff that Compass uses. I love Compass. And then you're able to type in Compass and you'll see all the commands that you can execute. And then pretty straightforward from there. If you have questions, feel free to ask me after class. But do you feel like this was a good topic? Do you think this will help you in your coding and stuff? Yeah? If you look in some web projects, WordPress, for example, they will use SCSS. Ruby on Rails uses SCSS. A lot of different projects use SCSS now as part of their framework because of the benefits that I've shown you here. And the nice thing is you can write regular CSS or you can write real SCSS code. It doesn't care. It will work. It will also give you an error message if you do something that's naughty. So you'll see that on your screen. Maybe I should do that before we run out of time. So if I go to do that, right? And then I refresh. It'll tell me an error and tell me the code that my problem is, and there it is.
That's nice.
And it also won't compile, just so you know. So everything will be broken, and it will tell you that at the top of your screen. So those are the benefits. And I definitely think that they're a lot better they're too good to be ignored. So go forth and do. All right. I'm going to close out. Yeah. See you later, Internet people.